Good morning, Dan and Amy. We got to clear out our Bernie cuts because he's been relegated to kind of a marginal player in this process
he
now.
Still has hope. I mean, he raised $40 million in the month of February alone. That's insane. So he has some money. He's going to keep going.
No. He can't keep that money. He has to redistribute it according to people's needs.
He's going to pay for everyone's student loans.
That is nonsense.
Pay him off.
In the tradition. Here's Bernie and his handsome wife in Vermont last night.
When we bring our people together, when we do not allow the Donald Trumps of the world to divide us up. When we bring our people together and when we have the courage to stand up to the billionaire class and tell them they can't have it all.
But enough about the Clintons. So Bernie is, he's gone. But I have to say, he went further on Vermont maple syrup, folk music, and the Marx Engels reader than I ever thought he could, which shows you how much discordance there is in the body politic right now on both sides. But for more on this, we're now joined by Ed Morrissey. He's a senior editor over at Hot Air, hotair.com. Ed, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, it's great to be on with you. Thank you for having me.
So one of the lines of argumentation that was being offered last night as the results were coming in, and now that the results have essentially solidified, is Trump had a good night, but he underperformed his Real Clear Politics averages, and Ted Cruz overperformed, and Marco Rubio finally got on the board, but he won late breaker. So this is still wide open. Do you believe that?
Yeah, actually, I think that it's certainly still competitive. And I think that what you're looking at here is potentially the situation might end up at the convention without a clear delegate winner, without a clear nominee. It depends on how long Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio can stay in the race, and more importantly, if they can win some of the winner-take-all states that are coming up after March 15th. For Rubio, it's got to be Florida. But Ted Cruz won a lot of delegates coming out of Texas last night, and he won Oklahoma, and he won the Alaska caucus, which had a smaller amount of delegates. Mm-hmm. And so I think he actually did pretty well last night. I think Ted Cruz came out of it with probably a little bit more bragging rights than Marco Rubio did. And I don't know that Donald Trump really underperformed. I mean, I think he got about the number of delegates that you kind of expect, somewhere between 250 to 300. And he came in, I think, around 285 last night. So I think he did pretty well, actually.
Ed Morrissey, Marco Rubio has 2 weeks to really make some waves, especially in Florida. What can he do to win his home state?
Well, I mean, first off, I think that Marco Rubio knows his home state better than Donald Trump does. The other part that I would say about Florida is that Rubio is going to know to concentrate on the I-4 corridor. Now, that's a band right across the middle of the state where there's a lot of votes there that are swing votes. If you look at Florida is, Mark Caputo of Politico once described it to me as sort of like a microcosm of the entire country. The north is sort of like the deep south, where the panhandle's at, because that's a deeply Republican area up there. The south is like the northeast because, Miami, Broward County, those are people that are tend to be a lot more liberal. But that I-4 corridor is your swing state. And if Rubio can pull a lot of votes out of that I-4 corridor, he can perhaps turn the tide in Florida. So you're looking at counties like Hillsborougugh, which is where Tampa is at, or you're looking at St. Petersburg, you're looking at Orlando, that whole band across the middle of Florida. So that's where a lot of the key demographics are going to be in play. If he can get the Puerto Rican vote by talking about the disaster that Puerto Rico has had on its economy and why that's just like, Barack Obama, that's a theme that you're going to hear from Marco Rubio over the next couple of weeks. He's going to hammer that hard, and he's going to do a lot of on-the-ground traveling. And I would not discount the idea that he could bounce back and get Florida with 2 weeks to go in this.
Now, I say the following as a Ted Cruz supporter, but isn't Ted Cruz winning Texas? Wasn't that great news for Donald Trump? I mean, Ted Cruz stays in. I mean, until lesser extent, Oklahoma and Alaska. Ted Cruz stays in. He has a compelling argument to make that he's the alternative to Donald Trump, not Marco Rubio. That goes back and forth on Thursday night in the debate. It goes back and forth for the next 2 weeks into Florida and Ohio and Illinois, North Carolina and Missouri. And if Donald Trump has the kind of night on March 15th that he had last night, boy, he really starts piling up delegates, and then it's increasingly difficult to see how he is derailed.
True. And I would say that Donald Trump actually did pretty well in Texas, too. I mean, he got, I think, something like 40-something delegates out of Texas. So, I mean, it wasn't like Donald Trump did poorly. Rubio didn't do very well at all in Texas, thanks to the thresholds. I think it's the 20% threshold, and Rubio only crossed that in a couple of the congressional districts in Texas. But here's what you might want to take a look at, is that if Rubio's gaining some momentum and Cruz is getting some momentum, and they both stay in the race, and more importantly, they can win a couple of winner-take-all states, it's very possible that the combination of Cruz and Rubio will have more than half of the delegates going into the convention. Not nearly enough for either one of them to win on a first ballot, but combined, they could keep Donald Trump from winning on a first ballot, and after that, you throw it to an open convention. And I think, obviously, both Ted, I know that you've talked to Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio before. I certainly have. Those guys go into these things to actually win outright, and that's what they're trying to do.
Yes.
But I mean, I think for the first time in a very long time, it's been in 40 years, you're looking at a real potential for an open convention come July. And so the question is what, can they win enough to do that? Can they win enough to keep more than half of the delegates away from Donald Trump on a first ballot? And by that time, will the Donald Trump phenomenon have cooled enough that an open convention would produce somebody other than Donald Trump at the top of the ticket? And so that's sort of the scenario that I'm looking at, because right now, Dan, I think you're right. If you're looking at just the way that the delegates are falling out, Donald Trump is by far and away in the best position to win. But if it's still a three-person race all the way down, I don't know that he gets half the delegates.
And some dead weight here, John Kasich, Ben Carson, any inkling as to when they're going to leave the race, especially, I mean, obviously if Kasich doesn't win his home state of Ohio, but what about Ben Carson?
Well, I think as long as the money's coming in for Ben Carson, he's going to stay in the race. I mean, it's a no-cost thing for him at this point. He's not, I mean, he doesn't have a political career that he has to worry about, oh, am I going to be credible for the next time I run? I mean, John Kasich, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, that is a sort of a market incentive for them that they are going to eventually have to respond to. Now, Rubio and Cruz are doing well enough in delegates, they don't have to worry about that. John Kasich has to win someplace. He narrowly missed one in Vermont. If he doesn't win Ohio, I think he gets out. But let's talk about that. If Kasich wins Ohio, then the open convention becomes actually more likely, because now you have three other people that are going to be splitting a significant amount of delegates. I think there's 66 in Ohio, and that might be enough to keep Trump from, again, getting the nomination on the first ballot at the convention. And most of these delegates are bound to the first and second ballots, and if they don't like Trump at the convention, you've derailed Trump.
Although a lot of those Cruz delegates may, as compared to Rubio. But Ed Morrissey, senior editor at hotair.com, is our guest. And Ed, one of the things, and this was particularly on display with Karl Rove last night, and I know it's his bag to break out the whiteboard and go through the delegate math, but when you watch some of these, what I call Don Quixote pundits, don't you get a sense that they're a bit missing the forest for the trees? The delegate math is important, but aren't you missing this movement that the Trump campaign has become?
Yeah, well, I think that that's certainly true. There is a movement that is behind Donald Trump. It is not necessarily the same exact footprint as the Republican Party. He's bringing people into the fold that might not have ever voted in a Republican primary before. The question is that movement sustainable? Do they stay with Trump in a general election? Does Trump do something to derail his ability to bring in the people who do normally vote? And so I think that that's the reason why delegate math matters, is because it gives you an idea proportionally where that movement's at. And so I'd say yes and no. Delegate math is obviously important, but it's way, way early still to see exactly where that's going to land. On the other hand, it's a pretty good measure of where Donald Trump's at, right? Because he has nearly as many, I should say, delegates as everybody else in the race combined. He's just slightly under 50% at the moment of bound delegates. And Jeb Bush spent $85 million, and he's got, 4 delegates? 4 whole delegates after $85 million. So, yeah, I mean, I think when it comes down to this, what you're saying actually demonstrates the delegate math itself, at least at the moment, demonstrates the power of Donald Trump's movement.
This is another question I have about an underreported portion of the discussion, and maybe it's my bias as somebody who has a bit of a background in being an operative. But is there a conversation to be had about the establishment Republican operative class and their, in my opinion, rank incompetence through this process now with all of the caterwauling and the apocalyptic predictions about the future of the Republican Party if Donald Trump is the nominee? They were late to understand what was happening, even though these individuals are ostensibly surveying the race and have their finger on the pulse of what's happening so they can position their candidate accordingly. And even in states like last night, Marco Rubio has a chance to spring an upset in Virginia. Was there a Marco Rubio play in Northern Virginia to take Kasich down a few points and try and push some of those voters over to Marco Rubio so he could have subsumed Donald Trump, which he didn't do, but he came close to doing? I mean, Donald and Kasich getting 18% of the vote in Northern Virginia, it seems to me that the amateurs in the Trump camp are better at playing three-dimensional chess than all the professional politicos in Camp Rubio and Cruz.
Well, I don't know the status of Trump's ground game in Northern Virginia. I would guess that he's probably doesn't have a big footprint there. But look, I mean, I think that we're dealing with a cycle that doesn't necessarily play out along the way in the patterns that we're used to, right? I mean, we just haven't seen a candidate like Donald Trump. And I don't necessarily think that the lessons that we're learning would apply to anybody else but Donald Trump. I mean, this is a guy who is a major media star. He's a guy who knows how to manipulate the media very effectively to his own ends. And even if you had somebody else with that kind of money, let's say Bloomberg, I don't think you could apply the same lessons to Michael Bloomberg, even though he's got tons of money. It's not a guy who's got the same sort of outsized personality and sort of brash, almost. I'm not even sure how you characterize his lack of filters, if you will. And so there's a lot of appeal to that, but it's really centered around Donald Trump. So I don't know if you can say, well, the political class is incompetent. I just don't think that you've ever seen a variable like Donald Trump that you can account for in these calculations. So they're doing what they know what to do, which is to get on the ground, take a look at what the situation is, try to turn out as many of the voters as they can, look for the openings that they've got. And Rubio, I think, exploited the Northern Virginia opening to the best of his ability. But when you're talking about something that is such an X factor like Donald Trump, I don't know that you can even blame this on incompetence in the consultant class. You don't know how to account for something like that until it actually appears.
All right, Ed Morrissey, senior editor, hotair.com. Ed, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.